At dawn, little girl whispered, "My mom can't breathe." The Hell's Angel acted without words. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the quiet street. It was the kind of morning that made you think the world was still asleep, at peace with itself. But as the cold air filled his lungs, Jake, Reaper, Morrison knew that today was different. His Harley roared through the empty road, the sound breaking the silence of the sleepy neighborhood. Jake had seen it all: violence, danger, and heartbreak, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would find that morning. As he coasted down the quiet suburban street, he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the engine. A small voice, full of desperation and fear, calling out for help. "My mom can't breathe." Without a second thought, Jake slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. He skidded to a stop and looked around. There, on the curb, was a little girl, no older than 7, her wide eyes filled with terror. She was clutching her mother's limp hand, her tiny frame trembling with fear. The woman lying on the ground looked to be in her mid-30s, but there was something wrong. She was gasping for air, her chest rising and falling erratically. Jake's instincts kicked in. He wasn't a doctor, but he had been in enough tight spots to know when someone was in serious trouble. He quickly pulled off his leather gloves, dropped his bike to the side, and rushed over to the woman. The little girl stepped back, still holding her mother's hand, her face pale with worry. Jake knelt beside the woman, his rough hands gently lifting her head. He could feel the ragged breath she was struggling to take, her lips turning blue. "Hang on, lady. I'm gonna help you," Jake muttered, his voice gruff but filled with determination. He knew he couldn't waste time. He scanned the area for help, but there was no one. The neighborhood was still asleep, unaware of the emergency unfolding just yards away. Without hesitation, Jake picked up the woman, cradling her gently in his strong arms. The little girl watched in silence, her small face full of fear, but also a flicker of hope. Jake looked at her and whispered, "It's going to be okay. I've got her." The girl nodded, though her fear was still evident in her eyes. As he carried the woman, Jake couldn't help but feel a pang in his chest. The sight of the little girl, so small, so scared, reminded him of his own past, of the child he once tried to protect, only to lose. He quickly shook off the thoughts. There was no time for memories right now. The woman needed help, and he was the only one there who could give it. He made his way to the closest hospital, praying that he would make it in time. The streets seemed empty, the town still caught in the quiet haze of early morning. Every second counted, but the weight of the woman in his arms seemed heavier with every step. He could feel the desperation creeping in, but he refused to let himself give in to it. He was a Hell's Angel, known for his toughness, but in this moment, all he cared about was saving this woman's life. The little girl remained quiet, following him every step of the way. Jake knew she was scared, but he also knew she was trusting him in a way that made him more determined than ever. When they finally reached the hospital, Jake burst through the doors, calling for help. Nurses rushed over, their eyes wide with surprise at the sight of the biker, but they didn't hesitate. They immediately took the woman from Jake's arms, rushing her into a nearby room. The little girl stayed close to Jake, her tiny hand gripping his leather jacket. Jake kneeled down beside her, giving her a reassuring smile. "She's in good hands now," he said softly. The girl nodded, but Jake could see the worry still in her eyes. As the doctors worked to stabilize the woman, Jake couldn't help but wonder what had brought them here, to this moment. What had led to this woman's collapse? And why was the little girl so calm? Despite the chaos? He didn't know the answers, but he was determined to find out. This was just the beginning. The hospital was a blur of motion. Nurses and doctors rushed around, but Jake, Reaper, Morrison remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the door to the emergency room. The little girl, still clutching his leather jacket, stood beside him. Her small hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her face pale with worry. He could feel the weight of her fear, and though he was known for his cold demeanor, A tightness in his chest told him this time was different. He couldn't walk away. He couldn't leave her. The minutes felt like hours. Jake shifted on his feet, looking around at the sterile environment of the hospital, the smell of antiseptic heavy in the air. He had never been comfortable in places like this. The noise, the beeping, the unfamiliar faces, everything about it was a stark contrast to the life he'd known on the road. But he had made a promise, and he wasn't one to break his word. Finally, a doctor emerged from the room. She looked exhausted, but her expression was calm. She approached Jake and the girl, giving a small, reassuring smile to the little one. "Your mom's going to be okay," the doctor said, her voice soft but firm. "We've stabilized her. It was a close call, but she's breathing better now." Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He looked down at the girl, who had finally relaxed a little, though her wide eyes still showed concern. "Thank you," he muttered, his voice rougher than usual. The doctor nodded, her expression shifting slightly as she glanced between Jake and the girl. "You two must be pretty close," she remarked, a hint of curiosity in her tone. Jake hesitated for a moment before answering. "We're getting there." The doctor gave him an understanding look before turning to the little girl. "And what's your name, sweetie?" "Emma," the girl said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Jake," he added. The doctor smiled warmly at both of them before excusing herself to check on her patient. Jake looked down at Emma, who still seemed lost in thought. He could see the worry creeping back into her features, and he knew he had to say something to calm her. "Your mom's strong," he said, crouching down so he was eye level with her. "She's been through a lot, but she'll pull through." "You're doing great, Emma." Emma nodded slowly, but the look of concern never left her face. "I was scared," she admitted quietly, her voice shaky. Jake's heart clenched at her words. "I know you were. It's okay to be scared. But you helped her. You were there when she needed you most." Emma looked up at him, her small face filled with confusion. "But I didn't do anything. I just told you that she couldn't breathe." Jake smiled gently. "That was enough. Sometimes, just telling someone is all it takes. You made sure someone was there to help. And that's something special." The girl's eyes seemed to soften, a tiny spark of hope flickering in them. Jake stood up, glancing back toward the room where the doctors were working. He had always been good at reading people, but he couldn't read the situation he was in now. What had brought Emma and her mom to this point? What had happened before Jake found them on that quiet street? It was obvious there was more to this story, but there was no time for questions right now. He could only focus on keeping Emma safe. As if reading his mind, Emma spoke again, her voice a little stronger this time. "Will you stay here with me? Until my mom wakes up?" Jake was taken aback. The request was simple, but it felt heavy. He wasn't the kind of man who stayed put for long. The road had always called to him, and his life had never been about waiting. But Emma's plea hit him harder than he expected. He hesitated, but only for a moment. "I'll stay," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." And he meant it. The next few hours passed in a blur of nurses coming in and out, doctors monitoring the woman's progress, and Emma sitting quietly beside Jake, her small form a stark contrast to his towering presence. He had never been particularly good at being gentle, but with her, it came naturally. It wasn't long before the sun was setting, the soft glow of the evening casting long shadows in the hospital room. The world outside was darkening, but inside, the atmosphere was one of cautious relief. Emma's mother was recovering, slowly but surely, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake felt something like peace. He didn't know what the future held for them, or what the connection between them would turn into, but in that moment, he knew he had done the right thing. As he glanced down at Emma, who was now dozing off in her seat, he allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. Maybe, just maybe, he had found something worth staying for. It had been 3 days since Jake Reaper Morrison had brought Emma and her mother to the hospital. In those few days, a lot had changed. The woman, Sarah, was recovering well, and Emma, though still a little shaken, was showing signs of the strength Jake had come to admire. They had formed an unlikely bond in such a short time. Jake found himself checking on Sarah every morning and evening, offering words of reassurance. But he knew this situation couldn't last forever. He was a man used to the road, not to staying in one place. Yet, something in him kept him coming back, kept him by their side. One evening, after a long day spent watching over Sarah, Jake sat by the window of the small hospital room, looking out at the darkened streets. The city was quiet, but his mind was far from peaceful. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he wasn't prepared for. Just then, Emma entered the room, her little face more serious than before. She was holding a small paper bag, the kind you'd get from a bakery. "Jake," she said softly, "I brought you something." Jake turned to her, his brow furrowing slightly as he tried to keep the concern out of his voice. "What's that, kiddo?" "It's just some cookies," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My mom always made them when I was sad. I thought you might like some." Jake couldn't help but smile at the gesture. He had seen a lot of things in his time, but this was different. "That's real kind of you, Emma. Thank you," he said, taking the bag from her. Emma's eyes brightened a little, but there was still a lingering sadness in her gaze. "I'm glad you're here with us," she said quietly. Jake's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet intensity. "I'm glad I'm here too, Emma. I'll always be here as long as you need me." Emma nodded, her small hand wrapping around his sleeve. "I don't want you to go," she said, her voice barely audible. The words hit Jake harder than he expected. He had spent years avoiding attachments, always running, always looking for the next thing. But here, with Emma and her mother, it was different. He wasn't sure why, but he felt a pull, a responsibility. He had always believed that the road was his only home, but now he wasn't so sure. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake said, his voice steady. "You don't have to worry about that." Emma smiled a little, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Jake." Later that evening, Sarah woke up. Her recovery had been slower than expected, but she was finally awake and able to speak. Jake was there when her eyes fluttered open, and he smiled at her. "Hey there," he said softly. "You're gonna be okay. The doctors are taking good care of you." Sarah blinked a few times, her vision still blurry. "Jake?" she whispered, her voice weak but filled with confusion. "Where am I?" "You're in the hospital, Sarah. You had a bit of a scare, but you're getting better now." She tried to sit up, but Jake gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Take it easy. You're not going anywhere yet." She relaxed back into the pillow, her expression a mix of relief and worry. "How's Emma?" she asked quietly. Jake turned his head toward the door, where Emma had been sitting quietly in the corner, reading a book. "She's good. She's been strong through all this." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, her face softening. "I don't know what I would have done without her," she murmured, her voice tinged with guilt. "You don't need to feel guilty," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "You're doing fine. Just focus on getting better." Sarah gave him a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Jake nodded, his gaze moving toward Emma again. He knew there was more to this story than Sarah was letting on. He had seen the way Emma had looked at him, the way Sarah had tried to hide her pain. But for now, Jake wasn't going to press. He would stay by their side, just like he promised. That night, after everyone had settled down, Jake found himself standing outside the hospital, looking out at the city. The cold night air hit him, but he didn't flinch. He had never been the kind of man who sought comfort. But now, for the first time in years, he felt the weight of something more than just the road. He had made a choice. He wasn't going to leave Emma and Sarah to face this alone. The past few days had changed him in ways he couldn't yet understand. But one thing was clear. He wasn't the same man who had driven through that quiet street just a few days ago. He was here for a reason, and he wasn't leaving until that reason was clear. But as the night stretched on, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get even more complicated. The peace he had found here, with Emma and Sarah, was fragile. And just as he was beginning to settle in, something, or someone, was bound to disrupt it. It had been a week since Sarah's recovery began, and the sense of calm Jake had started to feel was slowly being replaced by a growing unease. He had stayed by their side, offering support, watching over them both as they healed. But deep down, Jake knew things were far from over. There was something about the way Sarah and Emma acted that told him they were hiding something important. But Jake wasn't one to pry. He had his own past to deal with, one that had followed him for years, and he had learned long ago not to get too involved in the personal lives of others. However, when he found himself standing at the hospital window late one night, watching the lights of the city flicker beneath him, the weight of his own thoughts began to press harder on his chest. The road had always been his escape, his solace. But lately, being in one place, being needed, felt different. It felt like home. The next morning, after a quiet breakfast with Sarah and Emma, Jake decided it was time to have a conversation. He had never been good with words, never known how to handle situations where emotions were involved. But he couldn't ignore the growing questions in his mind. Sarah, Jake started, his voice gruff but steady. I need to know something. Sarah, who had been quietly sipping her coffee, looked up at him, her eyes a little tired but warm. What's on your mind? She asked, her voice soft. Jake hesitated for a moment before speaking again. I've been helping you both for a while now, but I need to know more about what happened. Why were you out there, on that street, so late? And what happened to you? Sarah's expression shifted, her face tightening slightly, and Jake could see her trying to find the right words. Emma, who had been sitting at the table drawing quietly, looked up at Jake. It's okay, Mom, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Sarah shot her a look, and for a moment, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Jake watched, sensing the tension between them, but he didn't break eye contact with Sarah. After a long pause, Sarah set down her coffee cup and sighed deeply. It's a long story, she began, her voice trembling slightly. She paused again, as if trying to gather her thoughts. I wasn't always in this situation. A few years ago, I had a life, a family. I was married, had a job, a home. She looked down at the table, her fingers fidgeting nervously with the edge of her coffee cup. But things changed. My marriage fell apart, and with it, everything else. I lost my job, my home, and then I lost myself. Sarah's voice faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. Jake could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of her past pressing down on her shoulders. I've been trying to rebuild ever since. It's not easy, especially when you have a child to take care of. She glanced at Emma, who was now quietly observing them both. We've been moving around, trying to stay safe. And the night I ended up on that street. Well, I wasn't expecting it to be the end. But it almost was. The room fell silent. Jake, though he had heard many hard stories in his life, felt the heaviness of this one. Sarah wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting to protect her daughter, and that made her story even more powerful. Emma, who had remained quiet up until that point, stood up and walked over to Sarah, taking her hand. We're okay now, Mom, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake watched as Sarah smiled faintly at her daughter, the weight of the past few days easing just a little. You're right, sweetheart, Sarah replied softly. We're okay now. Jake stood up and walked to the window again, his mind racing. He had a lot to think about. Sarah's story had answered some of the questions that had been eating at him, but it had raised even more. What was it that had pushed Sarah and Emma to this point? Why had she been so terrified when he first found them? And who else was involved in their story? It was clear to Jake that Sarah wasn't the only one with a past, and that past had a way of catching up with people, no matter how hard they tried to outrun it. You know, Sarah, Jake said, turning back to face her, you're stronger than you think. You've made it this far, and you'll keep going. Sarah looked up at him, her expression softening. I don't know what I would have done without you, Jake, she said quietly. I've been so lost for so long, but you've given me hope again. Jake nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He wasn't used to hearing people speak to him like that, and it struck him harder than he expected. Just doing what's right, he muttered, more to himself than to her. No one should have to go through that alone. Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered. Emma, who had been watching them both with wide, trusting eyes, suddenly stood up and hugged Jake tightly. Thank you for helping us, Jake, she said, her voice muffled against his chest. Jake stood there, frozen for a moment, before his arms instinctively wrapped around her. He had always thought that his job was done when he helped someone. But with Emma and Sarah, he realized that the work was just beginning. There was more to this story, and he wasn't about to walk away. Not now. Not ever. The days passed slowly after Sarah's revelation, and Jake couldn't help but notice the change in the air. The tension between them had eased, but something else was building, something he couldn't put his finger on. The streets were still quiet, but there was an undercurrent of unrest, a feeling that things were about to shift. Jake tried to shake off the nagging feeling. He had never been one to dwell on the future. He lived in the moment, taking life as it came, but lately, the quiet had become unsettling. He found himself looking out the window more often, watching the slow-moving cars, the occasional pedestrian, and wondering what was really going on. Emma had started to trust him more, and Sarah, though still fragile, seemed to find strength in his presence. But the reality was, they were still in danger. Jake knew that Sarah's past would eventually catch up with her, and when it did, they would all have to face it. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, Sarah asked Jake to take a walk with her. She had been feeling better, but her nerves were still on edge. She needed to talk, and Jake knew it was time to listen. "Jake," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I know I haven't told you everything, but I need to. I need you to understand why I was so scared that night." Jake nodded, listening intently as they walked down the quiet street. "I told you before that my life fell apart. What I didn't tell you is that there's someone after me. Someone from my past." Sarah stopped walking, looking up at Jake with wide, haunted eyes. "It's not just bad luck. There are people who want me dead, and now, because of me, Emma is in danger too." Jake felt his stomach tighten. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it from Sarah's own lips made it all too real. "Who are they?" Jake asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she folded them together. "A man named Vincent Garcia. He was my husband's business partner. When things went south, when my husband left, Garcia came after me. He thinks I know something that could bring him down." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "But I don't know anything. Not enough to help him anyway. That's why he's been hunting me, trying to force me into giving him something I don't have." Jake felt a surge of anger rise in him. He had seen the damage men like Garcia could do. He had lived through it. "You're safe now, Sarah," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "I won't let anyone hurt you or Emma. Not while I'm around." Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, but she held them back. "I don't want you to get involved, Jake. You've done enough already. But Garcia won't stop. He's dangerous. He's ruthless. If he finds me." Her voice faltered, and Jake saw the fear that had been hidden beneath her calm exterior. "He won't find you," Jake interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll make sure of it." The determination in his voice surprised even him. He had never been one to make promises, especially ones he wasn't sure he could keep. But this was different. Sarah and Emma had become something more than just a burden to him. They were a part of him now. He couldn't walk away. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and doubt. "You don't know what he's capable of," she said quietly. Jake met her gaze, his jaw set. "I know exactly what he's capable of. I've seen men like him before. But I'm not afraid of him." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You don't have to worry about Garcia. I'll take care of it." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly, though her worry didn't disappear. "Thank you, Jake," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what we'd do without you." They stood there for a moment, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees the only noise between them. Jake could feel the weight of their situation, the danger lurking just beneath the surface. He had always believed he was a man of action, not words. But here, with Sarah and Emma, he knew he had to do more than just protect them. He had to face the demons from his own past to ensure they had a future. As they turned to head back to the house, Jake felt the first real sense of clarity in days. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He was walking into something dangerous, and he couldn't do it alone. But he wasn't alone anymore. Sarah and Emma had changed him, and now, he was going to do everything in his power to protect them. They walked back to the house in silence, the weight of the conversation still hanging in the air. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He wasn't running anymore. He had a purpose, and he was going to see it through. As they reached the front door, Jake turned to Sarah. "I'll make a plan," he said. "We'll get out of here, but we'll do it my way. You stay put, and I'll handle it." Sarah looked at him, her expression both fearful and relieved. "Please be careful, Jake," she said softly. "I don't want to lose you." Jake smiled slightly, the first smile he had shown in days. "You won't lose me," he said, his voice low but steady. "Not this time." The door closed behind them, and Jake knew that the road ahead would be dangerous. But for the first time, he wasn't running from it. He was walking into it with everything he had. The next morning, Jake stood by the front door, watching as the early morning light filtered through the trees. The weight of what was about to happen pressed heavily on his chest. Sarah and Emma were inside, unaware of the exact plan Jake was putting into motion. He had promised Sarah that he would take care of everything, but that promise came with its own set of dangers. His thoughts were interrupted when Emma stepped out into the yard. She had that quiet look again, the one she had when something was weighing on her mind. Jake turned to face her, his face softening as he saw her standing there, her little figure bathed in the golden light of dawn. "Hey there, Emma," he said, trying to sound reassuring. She gave him a small smile, but he could see the worry in her eyes. "Are you really going to make sure no one hurts my mom?" she asked quietly. Jake knelt down to her level, looking her in the eyes. "I told you, no one is going to hurt your mom. I'll make sure of it," he said firmly. Emma nodded slowly, still not completely convinced, but she gave him a tight hug before stepping back into the house. Jake watched her go inside, then turned his attention back to the street. He knew that Vincent Garcia would come sooner or later, and when he did, Jake had to be ready. He wasn't just protecting Sarah and Emma now. He was protecting himself too. This was a fight he had avoided for too long. The road had always been his escape, but now it was time to face the things he had left behind. A few hours later, Jake made his move. He called in a favor from an old contact in the underworld, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. The deal was simple, information in exchange for a debt he owed. Jake wasn't proud of the methods he used, but there was no time for hesitation. As the hours ticked by, Jake worked tirelessly, making sure every angle was covered. Sarah and Emma were safe for now, but he knew Garcia's reach was far and wide. It wouldn't be long before he found them again. That evening, just as the sun began to set, Jake received the call. His contact had come through. Vincent Garcia had been located. Jake hung up the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. The time had come. He wasn't going to wait for Garcia to make the first move. Jake suited up, pulling on his leather jacket, the familiar weight of his cut a reminder of the life he had left behind. He wasn't a man of words, but he knew how to handle situations like this. He had survived far worse than Garcia, and he was ready to face whatever came next. As he walked out of the house, Sarah called out to him from the front door. "Jake, please be careful." Her voice was filled with concern, but Jake didn't turn around. He had already made up his mind. "I'll be back," he called over his shoulder, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. He got on his Harley, the engine roaring to life beneath him. The familiar rumble of the bike steadied his nerves as he sped off into the night. The city lights blurred in the distance, and Jake felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as he hit the open road. This was it. No more running. As he approached the location where Garcia was supposed to be, Jake's instincts told him something was off. The street was quiet, too quiet. He parked his bike a block away and moved in on foot, his senses heightened. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, and the air felt thick with tension. He crept through the alleyways, keeping to the darkness. Every step brought him closer to Garcia, but also closer to something he couldn't quite explain, a feeling of inevitability. As he rounded the corner, he saw the figure he had been waiting for. Vincent Garcia stood in front of a rundown warehouse, flanked by two of his men. Garcia's back was turned, but Jake could see the smirk on his face. He had been expecting Jake. Without a second thought, Jake pulled the gun from his waistband and aimed it at Garcia's back. "It's over," Jake said, his voice cold and steady. Garcia froze for a moment, then slowly turned around, his hands raised in mock surrender. "You think this is the end, Jake?" Garcia sneered. "You really think you can take me down just like that?" Jake didn't flinch. "I'm not here to talk." Garcia's men reached for their weapons, but Jake was faster. He fired 2 quick shots, disabling them before they could react. The tension in the air was palpable, but Jake stayed calm. He had trained for moments like this. Garcia took a step back, but Jake advanced, keeping the gun trained on him. "You're done, Garcia," Jake said, his voice low and final. Garcia laughed, though it was a bitter, mocking sound. "You think I'm scared of you? You should be scared of me, Jake. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Jake took another step forward. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with." With a final, decisive move, Jake knocked Garcia to the ground, his gun still aimed at him. Garcia didn't resist. He knew the fight was over. Jake stood over him for a moment, breathing heavily, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. This wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure Sarah and Emma were safe. The moment felt surreal, like it was all happening in slow motion. Jake turned and walked away, his footsteps steady and deliberate. He didn't look back. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. As he climbed back onto his bike and revved the engine, Jake knew that he wasn't finished yet. There was still more to do, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. The days that followed Garcia's confrontation were tense, but quiet. Jake returned to Sarah and Emma's house, his mind still racing with adrenaline. He had taken down one of the biggest threats to their safety, but deep down, he knew that wasn't the end of the story. The underworld was vast, and men like Vincent Garcia never worked alone. Sarah had told him about the people after her, but she had no idea just how deeply tangled her past was. That night, as Jake sat outside on the porch, the quiet of the evening felt almost deafening. The world was still, too still. The distant hum of cars and the occasional chirp of crickets were the only sounds breaking the silence. It was in these moments of stillness that Jake's thoughts became the loudest. He wasn't used to staying in one place. He wasn't used to caring for anyone other than himself. But the bond with Sarah and Emma had grown stronger, more real. He had promised to protect them, and even though the immediate threat had been dealt with, he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was looming on the horizon. As he sat there, Emma walked up to him, her little footsteps quiet on the gravel. She had a small, hesitant smile on her face, but Jake could tell something was bothering her. "Jake?" she asked softly, her voice a little shaky. "Are we safe now?" The question hit Jake harder than he expected. He had been so focused on protecting them from the obvious threats that he hadn't stopped to consider how this situation was affecting Emma. She was just a kid, but she had seen more than any child should. Jake looked down at her, trying to muster the strength to give her the reassurance she needed. "You're safe here, Emma," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "I won't let anyone hurt you or your mom." Emma didn't seem convinced. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "But what if someone else comes?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's heart clenched at the vulnerability in her tone. He wasn't used to this kind of emotional responsibility. His entire life had been about survival, about keeping moving. But now, there was more to it. He was no longer just surviving. He was protecting something, someone. "I'll be ready if anyone comes," Jake said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "No one's getting through me." Emma smiled a little, the fear still lingering in her eyes, but she seemed comforted by his words. Jake reached out and ruffled her hair, a rare, soft gesture. "You're stronger than you think, kiddo," he said. "And so is your mom." Emma nodded, but before she could say anything else, Sarah appeared in the doorway. She looked tired, but her eyes softened when she saw Jake with Emma. "Everything okay out here?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle. "Yeah," Jake replied, standing up from the porch. "Just making sure Emma's feeling safe." Sarah smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her gaze. "I know you've done more than enough already, Jake. I don't know how to thank you for everything." Jake shook his head. "You don't have to thank me," he said quietly. "You and Emma." He paused, looking at the two of them. "You're not alone anymore." Sarah's smile faded slightly, her eyes drifting to the horizon. "But we could be," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't even know if I can ever escape my past." Jake didn't know how to respond. He couldn't promise that everything would be okay, because he knew better than that. Life wasn't that simple. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her or Emma face it alone. "Whatever happens, you don't have to face it alone," Jake said, his voice unwavering. "I'm not going anywhere." Sarah nodded, a mix of relief and sadness crossing her face. She looked at Emma, who had climbed into the chair beside her, resting her head on her mom's lap. The sight of them, so fragile yet so strong, made something shift inside Jake. He had always been a man who kept his distance, who relied on his own strength. But now, he was fighting for something bigger than himself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the weight of their situation settled over him once again. He knew the danger wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. There was still more to uncover about Sarah's past, and more enemies to face. Jake wasn't foolish enough to think it would all be over just because he had taken down one man. But he also knew that he wasn't going to run anymore. He was staying, and he would fight for them, no matter the cost. The next few days were a blur. Jake continued to keep a close eye on Sarah and Emma, staying vigilant, making sure no one would be able to hurt them again. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he actually knew about the people Sarah had been running from. He needed answers, and he was going to get them, no matter how deep he had to dig. As the nights grew colder, Jake found himself spending more time outside, his mind racing with plans. He He knew there was a bigger game being played here, and he wasn't about to let Sarah and Emma get caught in it. He had already lost too much in his life. He wasn't going to lose them too. The next few days dragged on, each one feeling like a weight pressing harder on Jake's chest. The tension in the house was palpable, and though Sarah was still recovering, there was something about the way she moved, the way she spoke, that told Jake she was preparing for something. He could feel it in his bones. She was still running, still carrying the burden of her past, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up with them. But there was no running anymore. Not for her, not for Emma, and not for Jake. He had already made his choice, and he wasn't backing down. One evening, as the sun began to set, Jake decided it was time to take action. He had spent enough time waiting, hoping that Garcia's associates would lose interest, but he knew better. Men like Garcia didn't give up easily. They didn't let their targets slip away without a fight. Jake needed information, and he needed it fast. He made a call to the same contact who had helped him track down Garcia. "I need to know everything about Vincent Garcia's operations," Jake said into the phone, his voice low and firm. "And I need it yesterday." The contact hesitated for a moment, but Jake's tone left no room for negotiation. "All right, I'll see what I can dig up. But you're not the only one looking for Garcia. If you're not careful, you'll find yourself caught in the crossfire." Jake's jaw tightened. "I've been in the crossfire before. I can handle it." The line went silent for a moment. Then the contact spoke again. "All right, Jake. I'll get back to you." Jake hung up the phone and stepped outside. The wind was biting, and the stars above were hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. It was the kind of night that made the world feel small, like the walls were closing in. He knew that what he was about to do could change everything. It was no longer just about protecting Sarah and Emma. It was about taking control of a situation that had spiraled out of his hands. As Jake prepared to leave, he heard a soft voice behind him. "Jake!" It was Sarah. He turned to face her, his expression softening just a little. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern in her eyes. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Nothing's wrong," he said, though he could hear the lie in his own voice. "I'm just handling something. It's time to end this." Sarah's gaze dropped to the ground. "Jake, you don't have to do this. I don't want you to get hurt. I don't want Emma to lose you." The words hit Jake harder than he expected. He had been so focused on protecting them that he hadn't stopped to think about what it would cost him. He had always prided himself on being able to face danger head-on. But now, the thought of leaving Sarah and Emma behind was something he couldn't bear. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake said, his voice steady. "I'll be back. I promise." Sarah didn't say anything for a long moment. But when she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "I don't want you to promise that, Jake. I don't want you to promise something that could get you killed." Jake stepped closer to her, his expression softening. "I'm not making promises I can't keep," he said quietly. "But I can't let them get away with what they've done. Not when you and Emma are involved." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. "I understand. Just be careful, Jake. Please." He nodded, then turned and walked out the door. The cool night air hit him as he made his way to his Harley, the engine roaring to life beneath him. As he sped down the road, Jake's mind raced. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let Vincent Garcia hurt anyone else. He had made a promise to Sarah and Emma, and he wasn't about to break it. A few hours later, Jake arrived at a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town, the place his contact had pinpointed as a potential meeting spot for Garcia's men. The building was dark, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb hanging above the door. Jake's instincts told him that this was the right place, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He parked his bike a few blocks away and approached the warehouse on foot, moving silently through the shadows. As he got closer, he saw two figures standing guard outside. They didn't notice him until he was right behind them, but when they did, it was too late. Jake knocked them both out with quick, precise moves, their bodies falling to the ground with barely a sound. He moved inside, every step measured and careful. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with tension. Jake could hear muffled voices coming from the back, but he stayed hidden, waiting for the right moment. He needed to find Garcia and make sure he didn't get away this time. As he moved deeper into the building, Jake's heart raced. He knew that once he confronted Garcia, there was no turning back. But he also knew that this was the only way to put an end to it. He had to take control, for Sarah, for Emma, and for himself. The voices grew louder as he approached, And when he finally saw Garcia, he was sitting at a table, surrounded by a few of his men. Garcia looked up when he noticed Jake, but there was no fear in his eyes, only smug arrogance. "You really think you can take me down, Jake?" Garcia said, a twisted smile crossing his face. Jake didn't respond. He simply stepped forward, his gun raised and aimed directly at Garcia's chest. "It's over," Jake said, his voice cold. Garcia's smile faded as he realized Jake wasn't bluffing. But it was too late for him. Jake wasn't walking away from this fight. Not now. Not ever. The tension in the air was almost suffocating as Jake stood across from Vincent Garcia, the barrel of his gun unwavering, aimed straight at the heart of the man who had brought so much fear into Sarah and Emma's lives. Garcia's smirk had faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, but he didn't back down. "You think you can end it all right here, right now?" Garcia sneered, his voice cold and challenging. Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence spoke volumes. This was it, the final showdown. No more games, no more running. Just a reckoning. Jake's eyes didn't leave Garcia's. He had seen enough of men like him to know that they would never show fear, even when it was clear that the end was near. But Jake wasn't fooled by the bravado. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. The warehouse was eerily quiet now. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights above. The men Garcia had surrounded himself with were nowhere to be seen, either too intimidated or smart enough to stay out of the way. It was just the two of them now, Jake and Garcia, a battle of wills. "You think this makes you a hero, Jake?" Garcia said, his voice low, almost as if he was trying to get inside Jake's head. "You think you can take me down and everything will go back to normal?" Jake's grip on the gun tightened. "This is about more than you," he said, his voice steady. "It's about making sure Sarah and Emma are safe. It's about stopping people like you from hurting anyone else." Garcia's laugh was bitter. "You really think you're the first person to try to stop me?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "You're just another fool who thinks they can play hero." Jake's jaw clenched. "You're wrong," he said, taking a step closer. "I'm not playing anything. I'm finishing this." For a moment, neither of them moved. The air was thick with the weight of everything that had brought them here. The lies, the danger, the years of running. Sarah had paid the price. Emma had paid the price. And now it was Jake's turn to make sure it ended. He didn't know what Garcia had planned, but he knew the time for talking was over. "You don't scare me, Jake," Garcia spat, his eyes narrowing. "You're just a pawn in this game. You don't know the half of what's going on. You're too late." Jake's eyes didn't flinch. "Then tell me," he said, his voice colder than before. "Tell me why you've been after Sarah and Emma. What's your endgame?" Garcia's smirk returned, but there was something different in it now, a hint of something darker. "You really want to know?" Garcia asked, as though he was savoring the moment. Jake didn't hesitate. "I want to know everything." Garcia leaned forward, his eyes glinting with something dangerous. "You think I'm the only one pulling the strings," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You think I'm the mastermind behind this?" "No, Jake. I'm just the tip of the iceberg. There are bigger players, people with far more power than I could ever have. You're out of your league." Jake took another step forward, the gun still aimed at Garcia's chest. "You're just a coward hiding behind other people's power," Jake said, his words sharp. "And it's time for that to end." Garcia's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of real fear. "You don't understand," Garcia said, his voice rising slightly. "I was just doing what I had to do. I didn't want to get caught in all of this. But it's too late now. You can't stop what's coming." Jake didn't wait for him to finish. With a swift movement, he pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the empty warehouse, the shot precise and final. Garcia's body slumped in his chair, his face twisted in disbelief. It was over. But as Jake stood there, staring down at the man who had caused so much pain, something inside him felt hollow. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted to take a life. But there was no other choice. Garcia was gone, but the fight wasn't over. Jake knew that. He could feel it. There were bigger players out there, more dangerous than Garcia had ever been. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. He turned and walked out of the warehouse, the cool night air hitting his face as he stepped outside. The weight of what he had just done was heavy, but it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Back at the house, Sarah and Emma were waiting, unaware of what had just transpired. Jake walked inside, his heart pounding. Sarah looked up from where she sat on the couch, her eyes searching his face. "Jake," she said, her voice soft but filled with concern. "Is it over?" Jake met her gaze, his face a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "It's over for now," he said, his voice steady. "But we're not safe yet. There's more coming, and we need to be ready." Sarah's face fell, but she nodded. "I knew it wouldn't be that simple," she said quietly. "But we'll face it together, won't we?" Jake nodded. "Together," he said, his voice firm. He turned to Emma, who had been silently watching from the doorway. She stepped forward, her small hand reaching up to him. "Are we really safe now, Jake?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Jake bent down to her level, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm going to make sure you're safe," he said. "I won't let anyone hurt you again." Emma smiled, her small face filled with trust. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He would protect Sarah and Emma, no matter what came next. The following days after the confrontation with Vincent Garcia were quiet, but Jake could feel the storm brewing. He had kept his promise to Sarah and Emma, dealing with the immediate threat, but he knew this was just a temporary lull. He had taken down one enemy, but in the process, he had uncovered something much bigger. As Jake sat on the porch that evening, looking out over the quiet street, his mind raced. He knew that Garcia's death wouldn't be the end of the story. There were always more people in the shadows, pulling the strings, and they wouldn't take kindly to losing one of their own. The question was, how far would they go to retaliate? Sarah had tried to stay hopeful, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. She had been through too much to believe that the danger was truly gone. And Emma was a constant reminder of why Jake couldn't rest. Her trust in him, her hope that he could protect them, weighed heavily on him. Jake had spent most of his life running, avoiding attachment, but now that he had a reason to stay, he wasn't about to let that go. He was determined to keep his promise, no matter what it cost him. As the night wore on, Jake decided to check in with his old contact, the one who had helped him track down Garcia. It was time to dig deeper. He needed to know who else was involved and what they were planning. His contact had warned him that there were bigger forces at play, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. He dialed the number, and after a few rings, the familiar voice on the other end answered. "Jake," the voice said, rough but with a note of urgency. "I've got some information for you. It's worse than you think." Jake's heart rate picked up. "What do you mean?" Vincent Garcia was just the tip of the iceberg, the contact continued. "There's a network of people tied to him. Powerful people. I've managed to trace some of the connections, but it's not pretty. You need to be careful." Jake's mind raced. He had known it wouldn't be simple, but he hadn't expected it to be this deep. "Give me what you've got," Jake said, his voice low and controlled. "Who's behind all of this?" There was a pause on the other end before the contact spoke again. "I'm not sure yet, but I found some names. It's all connected to a larger operation, something that goes beyond just Sarah's husband and Garcia. There are people in high places who don't want this to get out." Jake's grip on the phone tightened. "I don't care about their high places," he said, his voice hard. "I care about getting Sarah and Emma out of this. You get me the information, and I'll take care of the rest." "You're playing a dangerous game, Jake," the contact warned. "These people won't hesitate to come after you, or anyone you care about." Jake didn't hesitate. "I'm already in the game." With that, he hung up the phone, his mind already moving to the next step. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Jake gathered his things. He couldn't afford to stay in one place any longer. He wasn't sure who was watching, but he knew he couldn't take the risk of staying vulnerable. He packed up his gear, making sure he had everything he needed, and stepped outside. Sarah was inside, sitting with Emma, and Jake knew that this might be the last time he saw them in peace. He went into the house, finding Sarah in the kitchen. She looked up as he entered, her expression questioning. "What's going on, Jake?" she asked, sensing the shift in the air. Jake took a deep breath. "I'm going after them," he said, his voice steady. "The people who are behind all of this. The ones who want you and Emma gone." Sarah's face paled, but she didn't say anything. She had already seen the determination in his eyes, and she knew better than to argue. "I'm not letting you do this alone," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. Jake shook his head. "I won't put you at risk, Sarah. This isn't your fight." She stepped closer to him, her eyes locking onto his. "It's my fight now too," she said. "You don't have to do this alone, Jake." Jake felt a surge of emotion. He had been running from people his whole life, never allowing himself to get too close. But with Sarah and Emma, everything had changed. They weren't just something to protect anymore. They were his family, in a way that nothing else had ever been. He took a deep breath, then nodded. "All right," he said. "We do this together. But we move fast, and we don't leave any traces." Later that day, they made their move. Jake's contact had provided him with more information, including a potential meeting spot where some of Garcia's associates were supposed to gather. It was risky, but it was their only lead. Sarah and Emma stayed behind in the house, Jake leaving them with the promise that he would return. As he rode his bike through the quiet streets, he couldn't help but think about how much had changed in such a short time. He had gone from being a loner, a man who only trusted himself, to someone who would fight to protect the people he cared about. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Jake felt like he had a reason to fight. When he arrived at the meeting spot, he parked his bike a few blocks away and moved in quietly. The area was deserted, but he knew better than to let his guard down. As he crept through the shadows, Jake's instincts told him that they were close. It wasn't long before he spotted a few men standing in the distance, talking in low voices. They were Garcia's men, and they had no idea that Jake was right behind them. The time for hiding was over. Jake moved in quickly, knowing that every second mattered. He didn't have much time before they figured out he was there, and when they did, all hell would break loose. The men in the distance were still unaware of Jake's presence as he slowly approached, his steps light and measured on the cracked pavement. He moved through the shadows, staying low and silent, knowing that he couldn't afford any mistakes. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was focused, honed by years of living in dangerous situations. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. He had tracked them here, to this abandoned building, the perfect place for a covert meeting. But Jake knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. The men, Garcia's associates, were standing by an old, rusted van, clearly discussing something important. From what he could hear, they weren't just talking about Sarah, they were planning something bigger, something that could put them all in danger. Jake had learned to read people quickly. The way they moved, the way they spoke, told him everything he needed to know. These men weren't just petty criminals. They were part of something much larger, a network that Jake had barely begun to understand. As he drew closer, he could hear one of them mention a shipment, something about a delivery coming soon. The words caught Jake's attention. A delivery? What was it that they were moving, and why was it so urgent? He had to find out. Without making a sound, Jake pulled out his gun, checking the safety before slipping through the shadows toward the group. His target was the man closest to the van, the one with the most authority in the group. If Jake could get him, he might be able to learn everything he needed to know. The plan was simple. Get close, take him out quickly, and force the others to give up the information. The element of surprise was on Jake's side, but he knew it wouldn't last. As he moved closer, the wind shifted, rustling the nearby trees, and for a split second, one of the men turned around. Jake froze, holding his breath, but the man's attention quickly returned to the conversation. That was too close. He couldn't afford any more distractions. Jake waited for the perfect moment, watching the man as he spoke to his associates. The conversation seemed to drift, and Jake took that as his chance. With a quick, fluid motion, he stepped out from the shadows, his gun trained on the closest man. "Stay quiet," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. The man froze, his eyes wide in surprise. The others quickly turned, their hands going for their weapons, but Jake was faster. With one swift motion, he fired 2 shots. The first man dropped immediately, and the others hesitated, caught off guard by the speed of the attack. Jake's heart raced, but he didn't let the rush of adrenaline take over. This wasn't about fear. This was about control. He moved fast, disarming one of the other men and using him as a shield, keeping the gun aimed at the remaining 2. "Tell me about the shipment," Jake demanded. "What's coming in and why?" The 2 men exchanged nervous glances, their hands still raised, but neither of them made a move. They were calculating, looking for a way out. Jake didn't give them that chance. He stepped closer, the pressure mounting. "I'm not asking again," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're going to tell me everything, or I'll make sure you won't get the chance to do anything else." The men looked at each other again, and then one of them spoke, his voice shaky. "It's not what you think," he said. "We're just the transport crew. We don't know what's in the shipment. We're supposed to move it and keep our mouths shut. Jake didn't buy it. Who's behind this? Who's the one pulling the strings? The man swallowed, his face pale. We don't know. We don't ask questions. We just do the job. Jake's frustration grew. He was getting nowhere with this line of questioning. He needed something concrete, something he could use to make sure Sarah and Emma were safe. What's the name of the guy who hired you? Jake pressed, his tone unyielding. The man hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. I don't know his name, but he's dangerous. Real dangerous. If you're looking for answers, you need to go after the bigger guy. Garcia was just a middleman. The real power's above him. That was it. That was the clue Jake had been waiting for. The real power. Whoever was at the top of this operation had been the one pulling the strings all along. Jake had known. That Garcia was just one part of the puzzle, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down his spine. There was someone worse than Garcia out there, and they wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to protect their operation. Where can I find him? Jake asked, his voice cold. The man shook his head. I don't know, man. He's got all his meetings in the dark. We just follow orders. I swear. Jake studied him for a moment before making his decision. He wasn't going to get more out of these men. They were too scared, too broken to be of any real use. But they had given him a lead, and that was something. With one last glance at the men, Jake turned and walked back toward his bike, the weight of the new information settling on him. The night felt heavier now, the stakes higher. There were bigger forces at play, and Jake knew that he couldn't do this alone. The plan had to change. It was no longer just about protecting Sarah and Emma. It was about taking down the people behind all of this, the ones who had used Garcia as their pawn. As Jake revved the engine of his Harley and sped off into the night, the sense of purpose surged within him. He wasn't running anymore. This fight wasn't over, and he was ready to finish it. The ride back to Sarah and Emma's house felt different this time. Jake's mind was heavy with the information he had just gathered, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a storm cloud threatening to break. As he revved the engine of his Harley, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became, and there was no telling how much longer they could stay safe. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't backing down now. He had made a promise to Sarah and Emma, and he was going to see it through, no matter the cost. When Jake arrived at the house, the evening sky had already darkened, the quiet streets offering no comfort. As he parked his bike, he noticed Sarah standing by the window, watching for him. Her expression was worried, and when she saw him, she quickly stepped outside. Jake, she said softly, are you okay? Her eyes searched his face for any sign of the struggle he had just faced. I'm fine, Jake replied, his voice calm, though he could feel the weight of the secrets he was carrying. What happened? Sarah pressed, her concern evident in her voice. Jake didn't want to worry her any more than necessary. I found out who's behind all of this. It's not just Garcia. He was a small player in a much bigger game. There are people who are way more dangerous. Sarah's face paled as she stepped closer. What does that mean for us? Are we still safe? Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his own nerves. For now, you're safe here. But I can't keep you in the dark anymore. The situation is more serious than I thought. There are people involved who won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to protect their operation. He paused, his eyes scanning the area to make sure they weren't being watched. I'm going after the people pulling the strings. But it's going to get dangerous. Sarah stood still, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resolve. Jake, I can't lose you too. Emma can't lose you. Her voice broke slightly, the vulnerability she had been hiding slipping through. Jake stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. You won't lose me, he said firmly. I'm not going anywhere. I promised you both I would protect you, and I intend to keep that promise. Sarah nodded, though Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. He understood her fear, but he couldn't afford to let it consume him. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. Emma emerged from the house, her small figure stepping into the doorway. Her eyes searched Jake's face, her usual sense of curiosity replaced by a quiet concern. Is everything okay, Jake? She asked, her voice small but steady. Jake smiled at her, trying to keep his tone light. Everything's fine, Emma. Just making sure we're all safe. The little girl looked at him with wide eyes, her expression a mix of trust and uncertainty. She had come to rely on Jake, and in a way, he had come to rely on her too. Her innocence was a reminder of what was at stake. I'll keep you both safe, he added, his voice firm. I'm not going to let anything, happened to you? Emma nodded slowly, though Jake could tell that she wasn't completely reassured. Okay, Jake, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I trust you. Jake looked at both of them, a surge of emotion rising within him. He had never been one for attachments, never wanted to let anyone in. But now, with Sarah and Emma, he couldn't imagine his life without them. I won't let you down, he promised, his voice thick with emotion. That night, Jake barely slept. His mind raced with plans, calculations, and possibilities. The deeper he dug into the web of lies and deceit that surrounded Garcia, the more complicated things became. The people behind all of this weren't just criminals. They were a network, an organized group with resources and power. They were in too deep, and they wouldn't give up their control easily. Jake knew he needed to act fast. The longer he waited, the more danger Sarah and Emma would be in. The next morning, Jake made a plan. He wasn't going to wait for these people to come to him. He was going to go to them. He needed to find out everything, who was behind the operation, what they wanted, and how he could stop them. But he also knew that time was running out. The longer he waited, the more likely it was that they would get to Sarah and Emma first. I'm going out for a while, Jake said as he walked into the kitchen where Sarah was sitting, drinking coffee. I've got some things to take care of. Sarah looked up at him, her expression serious. Be careful, Jake, she said softly. I know you're doing this to protect us, but I'm scared. I don't want to lose you. Jake paused for a moment, his heart heavy with her words. He didn't want to leave her, but he knew it was the only way. I won't let that happen, he said, his voice firm. I'll be back, and I'll make sure we're all safe. Sarah didn't say anything else, but the worry in her eyes spoke volumes. Jake turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. The world outside felt colder now, the weight of what he was about to do settling heavily on his shoulders. But there was no turning back. This was his fight now, and he wasn't about to lose. He would find the people responsible, and he would stop them, no matter what it took. The ride to the warehouse felt longer than usual. The road seemed emptier, the sky darker. Jake knew that the battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from anything. He was facing it head-on, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. The tension in the air was palpable as Jake approached the abandoned warehouse, the place where he knew the final confrontation was waiting for him. His heart raced in his chest, but his mind remained steady, sharp. He had come this far, and he was prepared to see it through to the end. The plan was simple: find the people pulling the strings, take them down, and make sure Sarah and Emma were safe. But as Jake walked towards the warehouse, a sense of finality hung over him. This wasn't just about protecting them anymore. It was about ending a cycle of violence, a cycle that had begun long before he ever met Sarah and Emma. The air was thick with the smell of oil and rust, the sound of his boots echoing in the stillness of the night. He moved with purpose, each step deliberate, each breath measured. His eyes scanned the shadows, his senses alert to every sound, every movement. The building was dark, only a few weak lights flickering inside. Jake knew that this was the moment. This was where it all came to a head. As he reached the door, he paused, listening. Voices. Low murmurs of conversation floated through the cracks in the door. Jake's grip tightened on the gun at his side, his fingers itching for action. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the shadows stretching across the floor. He could see figures in the distance, but they hadn't noticed him yet. Jake moved in silently, his presence like a ghost in the night. He crouched low, watching as a few men gathered around a table, discussing something that made Jake's blood run cold. This was it. The people responsible for everything, the people who had been pulling the strings all along, were right here. They were too focused on their conversation to notice Jake creeping closer. His mind raced with everything he had learned. The network, the power, the danger. These were the men who had caused Sarah and Emma so much pain. Jake was done waiting. He wasn't going to let them destroy anything else. Without warning, Jake sprang into action, moving faster than the men could react. He fired a shot in the air, sending the group scrambling for cover. This is over. Jake's voice was cold and firm as he stepped forward, his gun aimed at the men. They froze, eyes wide with panic, realizing they were no longer in control. Tell me who's behind this, Jake demanded. Tell me who's really running things. One of the men, a burly figure with a scar across his face, sneered at Jake, but there was fear in his eyes. "You don't know what you're getting into," the man growled. "You're in over your head." Jake stepped closer, keeping the gun trained on him. "I'm done playing games. I want answers." The man swallowed hard, but before he could respond, another figure stepped out from the shadows. It was a man Jake hadn't expected to see, a man whose face was familiar, a ghost from Jake's past. "You," Jake said, his voice thick with disbelief. "You were behind all of this." The man didn't flinch. He just looked at Jake, a small smile creeping onto his lips. "You should have stayed out of it, Jake," the man said, his voice smooth and cold. "This was never your fight." The recognition hit Jake like a punch to the gut. This man wasn't just some random player in the game. He was someone Jake knew, someone from his own history, someone who had been part of the reason Jake had left everything behind in the first place. "I left that life behind," Jake said, his anger rising. "I thought I was done with it." The man chuckled darkly. "You can't escape what's in your blood, Jake. You never could." Jake's mind raced. This was more than just a fight for Sarah and Emma. This was about his own past, the ghost he had tried to outrun. But there was no running now. He had come too far. He wasn't backing down. "You're going to pay for everything you've done," Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. The man smirked, taking a step closer. "You think you can stop this? You think you're the one who's going to win?" Jake didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. He moved in swiftly, disarming the man and forcing him to the ground. The men around him scattered, realizing the fight was already lost. Jake stood over the man, his chest heaving with anger and adrenaline. "It's over," Jake said, his voice unwavering. "You don't get to keep running." The man's face twisted in fury, but he said nothing. He knew it was over too. As Jake stood there, his gun still in his hand, a strange sense of finality washed over him. It was done. The people behind it all had been taken down. The danger was over, at least for now. Jake turned and walked out of the warehouse, his steps steady but filled with purpose. He had kept his promise. He had protected Sarah and Emma. He had ended the threat. And now, for the first time in a long time, Jake felt a sense of peace. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't alone anymore. When he arrived back at the house, Sarah and Emma were waiting for him. They didn't ask what had happened. They didn't need to. They could see it in his face. He had done it. He had protected them. "Is it over?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice filled with hope. Jake nodded, a small, weary smile on his face. "It's over," he said. And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. In this gripping series of Hell Angel stories, Jake faces a past he thought he had left behind. When he becomes the unexpected protector of Sarah and her daughter Emma, he is thrust into a dangerous world far darker than he could have imagined. As secrets unfold, Jake learns that the threats facing them are much bigger than he first believed, leading to a web of deceit, betrayal, and power struggles that only the strongest survive. With raw action, emotional depth, and thrilling twists, these Hell Angel stories follow Jake's journey through unimaginable danger as he risks everything to keep those he loves safe. The danger doesn't end with one enemy, and Jake must confront his own past while battling ruthless figures who stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Dive into these Hell Angel stories as Jake's fight for survival intensifies, and discover the lengths one man will go to for love and justice. Get ready for a heart-pounding ride through the underworld in these unforgettable Hell Angel stories where loyalty and sacrifice collide. As the tension builds, Jake is forced to reckon with the demons of his own past and a future that remains uncertain, all in the name of protecting Sarah and Emma. Will Jake be able to protect them from the shadows that lurk, or will the secrets of the Hell Angels stories be their undoing?